From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Eliza Campbell, Director of MEI's Cyber Program, sitting in for Alistair Taylor. For several decades now, despite many attempts at negotiation and reconciliation, progress on de-escalating tensions and reaching an agreement between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD, has remained a point of growing tension. As a result of growing water scarcity and economic instability in the region, diplomatic tensions between the parties involved has raised international concerns about possible military conflict, even as much of the public debate over the project has moved online. In early 2021, Facebook released a report identifying several campaigns of inauthentic content by state-backed entities, including Egypt and Ethiopia, who were reportedly attempting to influence public opinion online over the project across many social media platforms. This phenomenon raises many questions about the role of social media influence campaigns in the Middle East and globally as an arm of public diplomacy, as well as the potential role of disinformation and inauthentic content in interstate conflict. This is an incredibly complex and evolving topic, and I'm really excited that we have two incredible experts to help us think through this and clarify a bit. Joey Shea is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute's Cyber Program, focusing on digital information controls and operations, security, political violence, and the impact of technology across the Middle East and North Africa. She's also a PhD student in the War Studies Department at King's College London. Previously, Joey was a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, researching digital rights in the Middle East. Mirette Mabrouk is an MEI Senior Fellow and founding director of the Institute's Egypt Studies program. She was previously Deputy Director and Director for Research and Programs at the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East at the Atlantic Council. She recently authored, and now for something completely different, Arab Media's Own Little Revolution, a chapter in a book on the Arab transitions, Reconstructing the Middle East, and is the editor of a multi-author report called Rethinking Egypt's Economy. Mirette and Joey, welcome to the program, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So let's kind of start off. It's been a little bit since, Joey, since you released your piece, which I really do recommend that listeners go back and read. So just talking about kind of the introduction to this issue and kind of where we are with the state of play. So Joey, in your piece, you discuss how networked communications online have increasingly come to influence politics in Egypt and the region more broadly, including in the form of targeted disinformation campaigns and influence campaigns seeking to influence public opinion on this issue and others as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about your article and what you think are the main takeaways from what you found out?
Thanks, Eliza. So, as we all know, the GERD has been under construction since 2011, so over a decade now. And there's been a lot written about this diplomatic maneuvering between the three states, how the dispute is playing out in a myriad of regional, international, and bilateral forums, the technical aspects of the GERD. But I wanted to look at how these states were vying for interest online. And as you mentioned, lucky for me, Facebook, or Meta, I guess we now need to refer to it as, released two reports in the spring of 2021, accusing both Egypt and Ethiopia of sponsoring coordinated inauthentic influence campaign. So these influence campaigns were distributed across multiple Facebook products, including Facebook itself, Instagram, and WhatsApp. And the operations used a combination of fake and duplicate accounts, some of which were automated, to manipulate and influence the online public debate about the GERD. So my piece very broadly looks at the tactics and techniques that both of these states use to surreptitiously bolster their public rhetorical strategies. And broadly, what I found in the piece, in addition to the investigation itself, is that the tactics and techniques of the campaign paralleled official negotiations, diplomatic efforts, and sort of normal statecraft that we're used to and have been used to hearing about for many decades. And so this new form of, online influence campaigns, they both complement traditional diplomacy, but then also themselves have emerged as an important site of conflict and competition in the context of this dispute.
Yeah, thank you so much for that intro. And I'm wondering, readers can go back and see this. The report includes examples, and the Facebook report itself includes kind of specific screenshots and examples of what this type of content or inauthentic content might look like. Can you just walk us through an example from maybe from each country, like what, a potential Facebook post or article that's part of this campaign might look like, or what the narrative that they might want to be getting across might sound like in broad terms?
Definitely. So I guess I'll start with the biggest difference between the two campaigns. So the Egyptian campaign targeted both Ethiopia and Sudan, the domestic political audiences and the domestic public audiences in those countries, whereas Ethiopia only targeted its own domestic audience. And even in the report, Facebook accused both countries of coordinated and authentic activity, but it only accused Egypt of foreign influence. And just to give you an example, coming from the Egyptian campaign that was targeted at Ethiopia, so it included accounts and pages that posed as authentic Ethiopian entities, and they wrote in Amharic about news and political events in Ethiopia. And just one post as an example, it's from a page called Free Ethiopia, and there was a picture of Egyptian President Sisi, and the caption said, Egypt does not want to impede the development of the Ethiopian people. Egypt and Ethiopia are capable of negotiating and living in peace to resolve their differences. So, this post is clearly targeted at, an Ethiopian audience and meant to engender support and feelings of mutual respect between Egypt and Ethiopia. In a bit of contrast, Egypt's campaign that targeted Sudan focused on issues that are of high importance for Sudan in the context of the GERD dispute. So again, there were a number of pages that posed as authentic Sudanese entities. They posted in Sudanese Arabic, and the content sort of emphasized a lot, in many cases, the safety hazards the dam posed to Sudan. So, for example, one Facebook page posted an image of a flooded Sudanese neighborhood with the caption, "The sudden collapse of the dam destroys hundreds of homes in the Blue Nile state. What if the disastrous Renaissance dam collapses?" And so you sort of see these different rhetorical strategies in, this one campaign of Egypt targeting its foreign audiences and the different topics Egypt has chosen to either create a sense of unity or create divisions or sow further divisions in the context of the dispute.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And, I think for listeners in the US, in some ways, we might have the impulse to sort of wonder, like, oh, how could someone be taken in? Or like, what would the real impact of something like this be? But for anyone who's had a grandparent or a relative be taken in by a Facebook conspiracy theory or, something that they read online, I think we all probably understand the impact that this kind of content can have on people in a very real way. And I think this is a really great example of kind of the natural extension of that. So, Mirette, as a close observer of Egypt's political economy, you've written quite extensively about how the GERD has occupied an extensive share of political energy in the country and has recently, in some ways, helped to reshape Egypt's foreign policy. Can you give us just an assessment, at the top of this year, where things currently stand with the project and what you're watching for the future?
Right. Okay. Thanks, Eliza. Okay, where things currently stand. This is one of these issues that was murky 5 years ago. It was murky about a decade ago. It's getting murkier by the minute. As Joey mentioned, construction started on the dam in 2011. But actually, the Ethiopians have wanted to build this dam, and I think plans were first drawn up under Meles Zenawi in the 1990s. But we'll get to that a little later on. Joey mentioned some interesting things in that, various countries will try and use misinformation, although I think what I heard was not so much misinformation as to try and put across the Egyptian point of view on these things. And I will note that when reading Ethiopian media and Egyptian media and Sudanese media, I've noticed that actual Ethiopian, Egyptian, and Sudanese readers seem to have just about zero interest in the points of view displayed by the other countries, basically because this issue has become so entrenched in the national psyches of all these three countries, and specifically Egypt and Ethiopia, that it's become a point of actual huge rancor. So the dam it's the largest one on the continent. It's going to be capable of producing about 5,000 megawatts. which is more than double the country's current output. And bear in mind that Ethiopia has a lot of dams. This is not the only hydropower dam that Ethiopia has. Ethiopia has a lot of dams and actually makes a fair amount of money selling electricity to its neighbors. But a whacking great part of Ethiopia does not have access to electricity, right? And that's why it is one of the reasons why the dam is so important to Ethiopians. Ethiopians genuinely need electricity, and this dam has become sort of a point of national pride for Ethiopians. But again, I think we'll come to that later. The discussions over the last decade have hinged around a binding agreement. Egypt and Sudan want a binding agreement on the filling and operation of the dam. That's because Egypt and Sudan are the two most downstream countries on the Nile, Egypt being the most downstream country with Sudan right over it. The flow of the water affects them both to varying degrees. In Sudan's case, Sudan is about 50% desert. Egypt is 97% desert. And in Egypt's case, 96% of all its drinking and irrigation water comes from the Nile. So the issue is, under normal circumstances, even with a dam this size, under normal circumstances, there really shouldn't be a problem with this dam. In fact, for Sudan, there are serious advantages in that when flooding occurs, Sudan really gets it in the neck. So the dam could help regulate flooding, which is really, really important for Sudan. And then, of course, Sudan will probably benefit from cheaper electricity. It's already buying electricity from Ethiopia, but there would be more and it would be cheaper. So there are advantages. However, you want to bear in mind that Sudan's concerns are are significantly different from Egypt's. There are places where they overlap. But for Sudan, Sudan is mostly worried about safety. Okay, the dam is right next door to Sudan. It's about 25 kilometers away. It's in the Benishangul Gumuz area, which used to be Sudan up until the 1902 treaty with Ethiopia and Britain for Egypt and Sudan. So it's right across the border. And you want to bear in mind that this is the only dam of its kind in the world that has never had an ESIA. An ESIA is an environmental sustainability and impact assessment. And that one of the things that will tell you is the impact on downstream countries. And there are serious concerns about the safety of the dam. So the Sudanese are super worried about that. They are also worried about water level because during the first filling of the dam 2 years ago, Sudanese water stations recorded an immediate drop in the water levels in the first 24 hours. For Egypt, it's about the water. And both Egypt and Sudan are holding out for an agreement on, well, what happens if there's a drought? Because that's where the whole issue is. If there is a drought, what happens? Because the Ethiopians are going to need the water to continue to run their turbines to generate electricity. And Egypt and Sudan have been trying for the last 11, 12 years. And Ethiopia is not budging, basically because it feels it doesn't need to. And Egypt and Sudan don't really have leverage on it. So, and this is a political issue. It's not technical in any way. These three countries, between the three of them, have more than enough hydropower expertise to be able to sort out the issues, but they're not. That they're at an unpleasant stalemate at the moment. On February the 20th, I think, the Ethiopia started running the first turbine. There are 13 turbines on the dam. Started running the first turbine. Sudan was silent. Egypt put out a statement saying, hello, this is in violation of the 2015 Declaration of Principles, which was signed by all three countries. But I don't expect anything to change in the immediate future.
Yeah, thanks, Mirette, for that really comprehensive kind of state of play. And I think it's clear, and this is sort of where Joey's piece comes in, that this has become as much a battle of narratives and politics as it has anything else. And so, Joey, I guess thinking through, the main stakeholders and players in this dispute, when it comes to the online context and when it comes to the battle of narratives that's playing out online, what do you think each country is kind of hoping or betting on with their activities online and on social media? And how might this be part of the larger changing regional dynamics in the country and in the region, in each country?
Thanks. So I think that both Egypt's and Ethiopia's respective negotiating positions are clearly reflected in the approach of each campaign. And I will say off the bat, of course, there are three actors in this dispute mainly, but last year when Facebook made its disclosures, it only accused Egypt and Ethiopia of a coordinated and authentic campaign. Now, that doesn't mean that Sudan has not conducted one of these campaigns. It just means that Facebook has not identified it, or maybe they've identified it, but they just haven't chosen to disclose it publicly. So I guess as an initial caveat, I'll just say that I'll be focusing on Egypt and Ethiopia as the main two actors. But in the context of Egypt's campaign, I really think that the weakness of their negotiating position is reflected in the tactics of the campaign. So as I mentioned previously, Egypt was accused both of coordinated and inauthentic behavior and also of foreign interference. And we saw that its campaign was directed at Ethiopian domestic audience and at a Sudanese domestic audience. And I think, the campaign, obviously, it did parallel traditional diplomacy, and it also, tried to engender support from both of those respective populations towards Egypt's negotiating position. And I think, time and time again, as Mirette said, Ethiopia has gone ahead and done what it wants in the context of this dispute, and Egypt really has had no leverage whatsoever to be able to stop Ethiopia from going ahead and doing what it has planned to do. And I think on the opposite side, Ethiopia's tactics and techniques in its campaign reflected the strength of its negotiating position, in that they don't need to influence an Egyptian domestic audience to engender support. It's a purely nationalistic project, and they only really need to focus on the project in the context of their domestic politics. And I think that was one of the things that was most interesting to me is, of course, when these disclosures were made about a year ago, the civil war was really dominating, and still is today, the minds of Ethiopia's political leaders. And so the campaign's exclusive domestic audience also reflects the deep polarization and fragmentation in Ethiopian politics at that time and today as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Mirette, I guess going off of that, can you talk a little bit more about the role of the GERD as a source of political or national pride in Ethiopia and elsewhere, and how the Ethiopian government in particular has sort of doubled down on its regional ambitions using the GERD as kind of a tool? And how has the project and why has the project become such a charged topic at the political and international level? And how more broadly do you think it feeds into narratives about how each country wants to be viewed or wants to view itself?
For Ethiopians, I think it is impossible to overstate the importance of this dam as a source of national identity and pride. And that's important because, I want to be very, very careful here because I'm not Ethiopian. Ethiopia has many national and ethnic identities. All right. It's not, one Ethiopia, maybe one country, but as you can see with the civil war, there are very, very distinct ethnic identities. And actually, one of the things that has come up was, as I mentioned earlier, the dam was originally, plans for the dam were originally drawn up under Meles Zenawi, who was Tigrayan, and the Tigrayans are currently saying, well, the current prime minister really is taking credit for something that the Tigrayans put together. But in point of fact, Ethiopia will always have wanted a dam there because it's important to them. And it's one of the very, very few things that all Ethiopians agree on, regardless of ethnicity. And remember, this dam is it's self-funded. Okay, and this was funded through bonds and through taxation, and civil servants had to give up, part of their salaries. So it is funded by Ethiopia. So it's theirs. It's not a gift from anyone. It's their own, and it is a huge sort of. They want to become a national power player. Bear in mind that Ethiopia is already important, and one of the reasons why you haven't had more international involvement in this is because in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia is important and is important to all of those players who view the Horn of Africa as central to their own safety and trade and prosperity, including much of the Gulf. It's important to the US for various strategic purposes. So Ethiopia is important, but it wants to become even more important. The civil war is making things difficult on other levels, but actually it is, I think, impossible to overstate the importance to the Ethiopians, who are, regardless of their ethnicity, proud and independent. That is important to the national identity. It means that it is very, very difficult to threaten, cajole, bribe, shove national identity into any sort of external pressure. The same sort of goes for Egypt, in the sense that as foreign countries have found over and over and over, I mean, you can see it in the human rights issue, it is extremely difficult to attempt to browbeat or leverage or cajole or plead Egypt into doing something it doesn't want to do. So as far as the national prides are concerned, these things it tends to be a sticking point. However, in Egypt's case, and the same, by the way, again, for Joey's article, Joey's discussing Egypt and Ethiopia because that's where the report was. But if we look at the Sudan, because remember, Sudan is quite literally in the middle and is a power player in this issue on its own merit. Sudan is equally proud and has a national identity, and this is important for it, but it's a different kind of concern. For Egypt, the concern is existential. 96% of Egypt's water comes from the Nile. Okay. So if there is a drought, and typically, it could be anywhere between 3 to 7 years. If there is a lack of water for a year or so, the Aswan Dam will probably carry Egypt for a bit. It won't for 2 years. And therefore, the fear is very, very real. And there's also the fear in Egypt. And if you are online and if you're reading Ethiopian media and tweets and social media and Egyptian, and the same for Egypt and the same for Sudan, the attitudes are very different. There's a fear and an anger on the one side, and there is a nationalist stoking and probably a goading on one side. And this is, of course, this is people. This is not governments. I mean, governments work slightly differently, but in the case of the governments, it boils down to the same thing. Ethiopia doesn't think it needs to do anything. Egypt and Sudan strongly feel that it should, but have no way of making it happen. So it has occupied an outsized position both in foreign policy and on the national scene. You want to bear in mind, again, in many countries, there isn't a recognition of the damage of climate seen. The Middle East Institute is based in the United States, and you will have people in the United States telling you that climate change is a man-made construct, a Chinese conspiracy theory, whatever. This is not the case in either Sudan or in Egypt, particularly in Egypt, where farmers are painfully aware of the creeping threat of climate change, because last year's harvest was terrible due to weather swings. The same now. They are aware that there is less water, and they are deeply, deeply worried about the dam. So it really does occupy an outsized slot in people's psyches and on the political arena.
Yeah, Mirette, thank you so much for bringing up the climate perspective. I was just about to shift to that, because against the backdrop of this larger story, obviously, is the growing water scarcity and the growing threat of climate change in the region more broadly. And it's something, as you mentioned, in countries like Egypt, it's much more difficult to sort of forget or to sort of put in the background than it might be in a place like the US. And so, Joey, I'm wondering, it's not a coincidence that the GERD has become such a point of contention as kind of this broader symbol, or kind of this broader pressure point about the issue of climate change and about the issue of water security. And what do you see as the potential future connection between climate disinformation in the region, where climate change and its implications are already so much more present and destabilizing, and the broader kind of future of how this type of diplomacy is weaponized, particularly when it comes to countries like Egypt, that are actively trying to pursue closer relations with their neighbors or trying to kind of shift their leverage or vantage point in the international sphere?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think another point about Egypt's campaign that was directed towards Sudan is that it really reflects Egypt's negotiating strategy. So, over the past year, more broadly, even outside of the social media campaign, Egypt has pursued closer relations and coordination with Sudan. So, the two countries, particularly after the revolution in 2019 in Sudan, Egypt has sought to increase technical development and military cooperation. For example, in August of 2021, the Sudanese news agency reported that Sudan had sent 105 officers to receive advanced training in Egypt. So we've really seen that these two states have grown closer in their relations. And this is reflected in the campaign that we saw directed at Sudan. So, for example, one of the posts that Facebook identified was from a page that was called Sudan Today, and the caption was Ethiopia insists on filling the Renaissance Dam, an ongoing violation of the law. And this sort of this narrative of ongoing violation of international law is something that Egypt as well has really leaned on quite substantially. And particularly, in the context of climate change, I think that this example demonstrates as well the role that disinformation may play in future natural disasters caused by climate change. As these disasters become more frequent, social media will become, and already has become, less reliable source of information and will be increasingly weaponized by political actors. And so it will be interesting to watch this space as these disasters become ever more frequent.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think I would just mention, obviously, that this is something that I think not just in the region, but globally, the issue of climate disinformation and the issue of, the growing instability and very real warranted fear of a lot of its consequences will continue to be, I think, a greater and greater issue when it comes to the type of inauthentic content that you write about here. And Mirette, just kind of going back to what you mentioned, you've done a lot of incredible work kind of documenting the impact of climate change on, in particular, Egypt's agricultural sector. And you've noted how 30 to 60% or so, I think, of Egypt's workforce, depending on how you calculate it, is employed in some way in the agricultural sector. So how do you see this dispute over the GERD as part of Egypt's immediate to near-term future, particularly when it comes to the changing economy and the agricultural sector and the issue of unemployment in the country?
It's all one big messy pot. You're quite right on the figures. So Egypt remains an agrarian society, which is kind of funny for a country that's 97% desert, but that's because sort of Egyptians have always lived along the strip that is the Nile. About 30% of Egypt's economy of Egypt's labor force, my apologies, is directly involved in agriculture. The figure rises to about 60% when you consider people who are indirectly involved in agriculture, whether they are hauling it on trucks, whether they are selling it, whether they run factories that make tomato sauce and export it. It's about 60%. So it's huge, okay? Anything that is going to attack that means that these people need to be employed elsewhere. Egypt already has an issue with unemployment. Now, it's kept it down, and as a matter of fact, in the last quarter of last year, it was about some 0.45%. But you want to bear in mind that a disproportionately large part of that is younger people aged between 15 to 29, and a disproportionately large chunk of that is women. Okay, Egypt's biggest problems come not so much from Islamist extremism, which I don't discount, but not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is about 400 to 700,000 people who enter the workforce every year. Okay, so if you have less people involved in agriculture, what you're looking at is a slow, steady urbanization creep. Okay, which is disastrous for many, many, many reasons. It has a direct effect. Now, this is not all the dam. Climate change is already seriously detrimental. Like I said, the last year's harvest was bad. This year's, let's say, tomato harvest has been terrible because of the frost. Because bear in mind, climate change doesn't just mean less water. Climate change means creeping rising heat, which is terrible, but it means less precipitation, but it means more extreme weather. In Egypt's case, for example, the tomato harvests were chopped by about 70% due to frost. Okay, so and this is going to be worldwide. It's not just Egypt. Okay, this is worldwide, and the MENA region actually is going to get it worse than most other regions in the world. The problem is then that is going to be compounded by a lack of water and, of course, by a rising population. Okay, the last big drought that people remember. I mean, bear in mind the Horn of Africa it has a drought going on now. Okay, but the Horn of Africa, for example, if people might remember Band-Aid in the 80s when people were trying to help Ethiopia, which had a drought that was in the 80s. Now, Egypt was saved at that time because of the Aswan Dam, but at the time, Egypt had 44, 45 million people. It's now 103. So what you're looking at is increasing pressure on ever dwindling resources. So it's fairly serious. And the amount of water you're looking at, without getting into all of the treaties and all the rest of it, the amount of water that Egypt currently draws on the Nile from the Nile is about 55 billion cubic meters a year. Now, it actually uses about 114 billion cubic meters a year. And the difference is made up, generally speaking, through recycling. Egypt recycles more water than anywhere else and than any other country in the MENA region. Recycling and, of course, importing food. But for most Egyptians, when you talk to them, they say, well, and of course, the argument has always been that, some of the treaties did not take into account the riparian rights of other African countries, which is true. Okay, it was Egypt and Sudan. However, Egypt and Sudan are at the end of the line, so to speak. You can't, they can't take water from anyone else. And for Egyptians, they say, well, it's 55 billion cubic meters that we take. Ethiopia gets 936 billion cubic meters just in rainfall a year. Ethiopian cattle consume more water than all of the water consumed by Egypt and Sudan combined. But at the end of the day, it comes down to managing shared resources, because the Nile, like all rivers, is a shared resource. And this is not the only part of the world where there is struggle over transboundary resources. And that was actually one of the reasons why, when this issue went to the Security Council, there wasn't too much support, because other countries have transboundary resource abuse issues and do not want this brought up at the Security Council. So what you have is a situation that is growing more severe, more frightening, I think, by the year. And unless you have a political sorting out, unless you have a willingness for a political solution to this issue, I do think that we're going to wind up with a rather unpleasant situation.
Yeah, something to watch really closely. And superficially, as a big enjoyer of Egyptian tomatoes, I think this should be something that we watch very closely, if only for that. But definitely, I think part of a broader shift that really, we can avoid it as long as we want to. But there are some in the region who really don't have that luxury or that opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
So Joey, kind of thinking about that as we close out here. So you've written about Egypt's engagement in more low stakes uses of cyber diplomacy, what people are now kind of calling cyber diplomacy, taking over government websites, as well as the more sophisticated and kind of planned ones, like various disinformation or influence campaigns. What do you think are some key takeaways from this phenomenon of growing uses of, what some experts have termed cyber diplomacy, that point to larger questions of digital foreign policy in the region for Egypt and for other countries as well, particularly as more countries move to make more investments in technology and to try to digitize their economies in the face of, the growing climate change and kind of these economic disruptions going on?
That's a really interesting question. I think I'll sort of close out with a bit of a short history on where Egypt has come in terms of its use of these digital tactics and tools. So I think, since 2011 and in the years immediately preceding the revolution and the coup in 2013, Egypt was very focused on the use of digital tools for domestic purposes. And, this is not the podcast for it, but there's been a lot written and spoken about the use of social media in the context of the 2011 revolution. And regardless of what your take is on the impact or not of Facebook in 2011, there at least was the perception of that impact, and particularly in the context of Egyptian leadership, political leadership. And so in the early years of the Sisi government, we really saw that most of their digital tools were focused on domestic repression mainly. So manipulating media to support government narratives, the use of network filtering and monitoring technologies to block and censor websites, targeted digital attacks against Egyptian dissidents and activists inside the country, mainly in the form of phishing attacks. And what we've seen in the past few years is that, this domestic application of these tools is, of course, still ongoing, but Egypt has been applying these domestic tools and techniques to its foreign policy. And so, as we've seen in the GERD dispute, this is one important example. We've seen the Egyptian government expanding its influence through social media in Libya. And so as sort of tensions have been increasing with Egypt's immediate neighbors, we've been seeing the use of these digital tools as a parallel track to more traditional forms of statecraft and diplomacy. So I think we're definitely going to see the expansion of that going forward. I don't think that Egypt is about to become a sort of cyber leader. It does not have the same capacities as the cyber leaders in the region, such as Iran and Israel. It doesn't really have the cyber weapons in its arsenal to launch offensive attacks. The attacks that we've seen have not been very sophisticated. There was these website defacements on a number of Ethiopian government websites. But again, it's unclear whether that was a state-backed attack or not. But regardless, it was not a very sophisticated attack. So I don't think that Egypt is going to become a sort of leader in the region. And even in the information manipulation sphere, Saudi and the UAE are clear leaders in this regard and are regularly rely on social media manipulation in their external relations. And yeah, this is definitely emerging for Egypt, but it's still emerging, and I don't see it becoming a leader in the immediate future. But I do think that economically, Egypt has sought to project cyber power, and specifically in the sort of strategic development of undersea internet cables and data centers. So Egypt, has long reaped the benefits of its strategic location as a bridge between European and Asian waterways, and this sort of fortune of geography also positively impacts the cyber domain. So, for example, there's currently 17 undersea internet cables that run through Egypt. The US is the only country with more cables. And actually, earlier this month, Egypt and Greece signed a memorandum of understanding between Telecom Egypt and the Greece version of that to connect to the two countries through undersea cable systems. And this MOU laid the groundwork for the exploration of different connectivity options between the two states. And in addition to this, there's a massive project that Telecom Egypt is currently undertaking, the HARP cable that will hopefully extend around the entire continent of Africa by 2023. And this project is through Telecom Egypt with the support of the Egyptian Ministry of Communications and Information Technologies. So the Egyptian government is clearly seeing this as both a sort of tool of public diplomacy with its immediate neighbors, and as a potentially quite lucrative expansion into an economic sphere. So I think more so on the economic aspect, we'll see Egypt's projection of its cyber power.
Yeah, definitely kind of playing the long game there. And Mirette, just to kind of go to you for sort of a closing kind of set of what to recommend to our listeners to watch over the coming months, Looking at Joey's article and this larger phenomenon of the narrative power around the GERD, particularly in the face of climate change and kind of the narrowing of economic futures in the region, what do you see as the implications of this broadly for Egypt's future? And what should observers watch most closely for in the coming months to see how this dispute might escalate or might kind of evolve?
Okay, so it's a good question, but not one that I have a really good answer for because it's foggy. I will say that coming July is going to be the third filling of the GERD. Ethiopia has already cleared away about 17,000 hectares around the site in preparation for the third filling. I think Egypt and Sudan have been very lucky over the past 2 years because during the first and second filling, rain was plentiful. Okay. You have no idea whether it's going to be plentiful this year. So if it's plentiful this year, then what we're going to settle in, I think, is a longer period of all three countries thrashing it out for as long as possible until something has to happen. If, God forbid, there isn't very much rain this year, then that's going to accelerate the timeline massively because then you're going to get a good look at how much water will be released. Now, bear in mind, again, only one of those turbines is running. There are 13 turbines, and it's going to be a while before this kicks in. But I do think that with everything that's happening in the Horn, with the problems in Ethiopia, with the problems in Sudan, I do think that it's going to be necessary to try and accelerate some sort of solution to this issue. And I say that because that's the thing that should happen. But again, there is a good possibility that all three countries can remain in this sort of ugly stalemate until something happens to try and shake people out of that stalemate. But as for I do think that the influence on the region's foreign policy, and not just the region, because here you're talking about MENA and the Horn of Africa, I do think it's interesting to watch the interplay between the different countries and get a good look at who is important to whom. I mean, for example, Ethiopia has really seen its importance and its relevance in the region blossom under this issue, and it's seen it blossom in the sense that countries are not trying to pose that much pressure on it because it's important. Okay, and Egypt and Sudan have struggled for recognition. But I do think it's a good idea to take a look at the various geopolitical dancing that will go on in the MENA region and in the Horn of Africa.
Well, Mirette, I don't know if I agree with that not being a good answer. I think that was an incredibly helpful and interesting kind of way to think about this question. And yeah, despite either of your protestations, I'll definitely look to both of you to sort of be prognosticators on this and other issues as we look to the future. So thanks so much to both of you for speaking with me. This is an incredibly complex and fast-moving topic. I do hope and recommend that our readers take a look at both Mirette and Joey's writing on these topics. And I'm so glad that we got to work through some of the issues involved. Joey and Mirette, thanks again for joining us for Middle East Focus.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.